September the 12th, 1942. Somewhere in the vast emptiness of the South Atlantic, roughly halfway between the coast of West Africa and the tiny volcanic speck of Ascension Island, a German submarine surfaced into the tropical night. Korvettenkapitän Werner Hartenstein stood on the conning tower of U-156 and stared at what he had done. The water around him was filled with screaming voices. Hundreds of people thrashed in the darkness, clinging to wreckage, calling out in English and Italian and Polish. The armed British troopship RMS Laconia, over 19,000 tons, was sinking fast beneath the stars. Hartenstein had torpedoed her just hours earlier, a legitimate military target under the rules of war. But now, as his crew hauled survivors from the black water, he discovered something that changed everything. Among the 2,732 people aboard that ship were nearly 1,800 Italian prisoners of war. His own allies, women and children too. Hartenstein made a decision that would echo through the rest of the war and beyond. He ordered a full rescue operation. He draped a makeshift Red Cross banner across the conning tower. He broadcast an open radio message in plain English on the international distress frequency, promising not to attack any ship that came to help. He was a U-boat commander in the middle of a war, and he was trying to save the enemy. What happened next would change the way German submariners thought about their opponents for the rest of the conflict. And it would become one of the reasons why, when the war finally ended, the men of the U-boat fleet made a choice that still surprises historians to this day. They did not simply surrender. They chose who to surrender to. To understand why that choice mattered so much, you first have to understand what it meant to serve aboard a German submarine during the Second World War. The U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine was, in proportional terms, the deadliest branch of the entire German military. Of roughly 40,000 men who sailed on operational U-boats during the war, approximately 28,000 to 30,000 were killed. That is a casualty rate of around 75%. Some calculations push it closer to 80%. No other major service branch on any side of the conflict came close to those numbers. The men who climbed down through the hatch of a Type 7C boat, the workhorse of the fleet, entered a steel tube 67 meters long and barely 6 meters wide. They shared that space with 44 to 60 other men. Diesel engines, torpedoes, batteries, and a single toilet for most of the crew. They slept in hot bunks, meaning 2 or 3 men shared the same narrow bed on rotating watches. There were no showers. The air was a permanent mixture of diesel fumes, sweat, cooking grease, and mildew. Fresh food ran out within the first week or two of a patrol. After that, the men ate tinned provisions, hard bread, and whatever the cook could manage in a galley barely large enough for one man to stand. Condensation dripped from the overhead pipes and coated everything in a film of moisture. Clothing never dried. Leather boots grew mold. The men developed skin rashes, boils, and fungal infections that the single medical orderly aboard could do little to treat. Patrols lasted 8 to 12 weeks. By 1944, with the introduction of the snorkel breathing device, some boats spent weeks fully submerged without ever surfacing. The snorkel allowed the diesel engines to draw air from above the waterline while the boat remained just below the surface, but the system was imperfect. When waves covered the snorkel head valve, it would slam shut, and the engines would begin drawing air from inside the submarine itself. The sudden drop in pressure caused agonizing pain in the ears and sinuses of every man aboard. Some men suffered burst eardrums. The carbon dioxide levels would spike, causing headaches, nausea, and disorientation. Men fainted at their stations. The psychological toll was immense. These men lived under constant threat of depth charge attack, where the only warning was the metallic ping of enemy sonar, followed by the shattering boom of explosions that could crush the hull like a tin can. A close detonation would shatter light bulbs, crack gauges, and send cork insulation raining down from the ceiling. The crew would sit in total darkness, listening to the groaning of the hull, feeling the boat shudder with each blast, not knowing if the next one would be the one that broke through. Some attacks lasted hours. The men could do nothing but wait, breathe as slowly as possible to conserve oxygen, and hope that the escorts above would eventually lose contact and move on. On October 24, 1943, Kapitan Lieutenant Peter Schech of U-505 took his own life aboard his own submarine during a depth charge attack in the Atlantic east of the Azores. It remains the only fully documented suicide of a U-boat commander at sea, but it reflected the broader reality of a service pushed beyond human endurance. The early years had been very different. In the summer and autumn of 1940, a period the U-boat crews themselves called the Happy Time, German submarines ravaged Allied shipping in the Atlantic with near impunity. Operating on the surface at night against weakly escorted convoys, they sank 217 Allied ships while losing only 2 U-boats. The tactics were devastatingly simple. A wolf pack of submarines would spread out across the expected convoy route, forming a long patrol line. The first boat to sight the convoy would shadow it and report its position, course and speed, to U-boat headquarters in Lorient, France. Donitz would then direct the other boats to converge on the target. The attack came after dark. The U-boats would run in on the surface, their low silhouettes nearly invisible against the Black Sea, and fire their torpedoes from close range. The escorts, few in number and poorly equipped with early radar and sonar, could do little against attackers they could not see. Commanders like Günther Prien of U-47, Otto Kretschmer of U-99, and Joachim Schepke of U-100 became national heroes. Prien had already earned legendary status by penetrating the Royal Navy anchorage at Scapa Flow in October 1939 and sinking the battleship HMS Royal Oak at anchor. It was one of the most audacious naval operations of the entire war. Kretschmer became the tonnage king, the most successful U-boat ace of the war, sinking 47 ships totaling over 274,000 tons. His technique was different from most commanders. Rather than firing long-range spreads of torpedoes, he preferred to penetrate inside the convoy columns themselves, sailing on the surface among the merchant ships in the darkness, and firing single torpedoes at close range. It was extraordinarily dangerous, but it was also extraordinarily effective. These men were celebrated in newsreels and propaganda. They received the Knight's Cross from Hitler himself. The U-boat service was the elite of the Kriegsmarine, and Admiral Karl Donitz, their commander, cultivated an almost fatherly relationship with his crews. He toured operational bases personally. He knew commanders by name. He awarded decorations himself. The bond between Donitz and his men was real, and it would prove decisive in the final days of the war. A second wave of success came in early 1942 after the United States entered the war. Operation Drumbeat sent U-boats to the American eastern seaboard, where cities had not yet imposed blackouts, and convoy systems did not yet exist. American merchant ships sailed alone with their lights blazing, silhouetted against the glow of coastal cities. The slaughter was extraordinary. In May 1942 alone, Allied losses reached 111 ships. But this golden period was already ending. The Allies were learning. Convoy tactics improved. Escort groups became more experienced. New technologies, long-range aircraft, improved radar, high-frequency direction finding, and the breaking of German naval codes at Bletchley Park were tipping the balance. The U-boats were being hunted with increasing efficiency. Then came May 1943, the month the U-boat men would forever call Black May. In those 31 days, the Allies sank 43 German submarines. Roughly 1 in 4 operational boats was destroyed. The crew losses were staggering. The vast majority of men aboard those 43 boats were killed, with fewer than 200 survivors pulled from the wreckage. The cause of this sudden catastrophe was not any single weapon or tactic. It was the convergence of everything the Allies had been building toward. Very long-range Liberator aircraft now closed the mid-Atlantic air gap where U-boats had previously hunted without fear of air attack. Escort carrier groups provided air cover directly with the convoys. Improved centimetric radar, which the Germans could not yet detect, allowed Allied aircraft to locate surfaced U-boats at night. High-frequency direction finding, known to the Allies by the nickname Huff Duff, allowed escort commanders to pinpoint the location of a transmitting U-boat and vector aircraft or warships to the position. And at Bletchley Park, the sustained breaking of the German Enigma naval codes meant that convoy routes could be adjusted to avoid wolfpack concentrations, while hunter-killer groups could be directed to where the submarines were gathering. On May 24th, Donitz made the agonizing decision to withdraw his U-boats from the North Atlantic. It was the turning point. From that month onward, the U-boat war became a slow, grinding defeat. 2/3 of the remaining boats would never sink another ship. By 1944 and 45, a crew going to sea knew their odds of returning were roughly 1 in 4. The men still went. They followed orders. But the calculus had shifted from glory to survival, and survival increasingly meant one thing: getting captured by the right enemy. Now back to the South Atlantic and the Laconia. After Hartenstein began his rescue, Dönitz, under intense pressure from Hitler, authorized the operation to continue. He directed 2 more U-boats, U-506 and U-507, along with the Italian submarine Comandante Capellini to assist. Vichy French warships sailed from Dakar and Conakry to collect survivors. For 4 days, German and Italian submariners worked alongside their enemies to save lives. Hartenstein's U-156 had survivors crammed below decks and packed onto the outer casing, towing 4 lifeboats behind. A Red Cross flag flew openly from the conning tower. On September the 16th, a United States Army Air Force's B-24 Liberator bomber from the secret American base on Ascension Island spotted the submarine. The pilot could see the Red Cross flag. He could see the lifeboats. He could see the survivors on the deck. He reported back to base. The order came from Captain Robert Richardson III, sink the submarine. The bomber made multiple attack runs, dropping bombs and depth charges on U-156 and the lifeboats it was towing. Dozens of Laconia survivors, the very people Hartenstein was trying to save, were killed in the attack. Hartenstein was forced to cut the tow ropes, order survivors back into the water, and crash dive to save his boat. Of the 2,732 people who had been aboard the Laconia, over 1,600 died. Among the dead were more than 1,400 of the Italian prisoners of war. Hartenstein himself survived the Laconia incident, but not the war. 6 months later, on March 8, 1943, U-156 was sunk by depth charges from an American PBY Catalina flying boat off Barbados. The entire crew was lost. The consequences of the Laconia incident were immediate and far-reaching. On September the 17th, 1942, Dönitz issued what became known as the Laconia Order, transmitted under the signal designation Triton Null. The order stated that no attempt of any kind was to be made to rescue members of ships that had been sunk. It forbade picking up survivors from the water, righting capsized lifeboats, or providing food and water. The exact words concluded with a blunt instruction: be harsh. This order became the central piece of evidence against Dönitz at the Nuremberg trials after the war. The prosecution argued it was effectively a command to kill survivors. The defense argued it was a defensive measure, ordering crews not to endanger themselves by surfacing for rescues in a war zone where they would be attacked regardless of any flag they flew. In the end, United States Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz provided an affidavit confirming that American submarines had practiced unrestricted warfare against Japan from the first day of the Pacific War. The charge was effectively neutralized. Dönitz received 10 years imprisonment, but not for unrestricted submarine warfare or for the Laconia Order specifically. For the men serving aboard the U-boats, the Laconia incident left a psychological mark that went far deeper than any legal proceeding. It crystallized a belief that had been forming through scattered incidents and whispered conversations. The Americans were unpredictable. They would attack a submarine flying a Red Cross flag while it was rescuing survivors. The British, on the other hand, were the enemy, yes. They were deadly. Their escorts and aircraft killed thousands of U-boat men throughout the war. But they were predictable. They followed certain rules. They had centuries of naval tradition. And when a U-boat crew ended up in the water, the Royal Navy, more often than not, pulled them out. This was not mere sentiment. There were documented incidents throughout the war that reinforced the perception. The most famous case involved Otto Kretschmer himself, the greatest U-boat ace of the war. On March 17, 1941, Kretschmer's U-99 was caught on the surface by the British destroyer HMS Walker, commanded by Commander Donald Macintyre, during an attack on convoy HX-112. Depth charges crippled the submarine. The hull was breached. Water was flooding in. Kretschmer ordered his crew to abandon ship. He surfaced the boat one final time, and his men began climbing out of the conning tower into the cold North Atlantic night. Macintyre ceased fire the moment U-99's crew appeared on deck, signalling surrender. A British sailor climbed down a scrambling net on the side of the destroyer and physically hauled the exhausted Kretschmer from the icy water. There was no roughness, no retribution, just one sailor pulling another from the sea. Kretschmer was taken aboard, given dry clothing and hot food, and treated as a professional adversary. Macintyre himself met the German commander, and the two men, who had been trying to kill each other just minutes before, spoke with mutual respect. The Royal Navy interrogation report described Kretschmer as quiet and deliberate, looking more like a student than a U-boat captain. Kretschmer himself had earned a reputation for chivalry toward merchant ship survivors, often giving them food, water, and a compass bearing to the nearest land before departing. He had once surfaced after sinking a merchant vessel in the dark, called out to the lifeboats to confirm the survivors were safe, and provided them with the course to the nearest coast. The British recognised this. Macintyre and Kretschmer maintained a correspondence after the war that lasted for decades, a relationship founded on the mutual recognition that they had fought each other fairly. The treatment Kretschmer received after capture set the pattern for how captured U-boat men experienced British and Commonwealth custody. He was initially interrogated at the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Centre, a network of stately homes in the English countryside that the British had converted into the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation of the war. At Latimer House in Buckinghamshire and Trent Park in North London, captured German officers were housed in what amounted to a gentleman's club atmosphere. The rooms were comfortable, the food was good, officers dined together and were encouraged to relax and talk freely among themselves. What they did not know was that every room was bugged. Every conversation was recorded. German Jewish refugees who had fled to Britain and joined the British Army served as secret listeners, monitoring thousands of hours of unguarded conversation. It was an intelligence goldmine, and it worked precisely because the prisoners were treated well. Winston Churchill himself reportedly complained that the German prisoners were being treated too generously. But the intelligence chiefs knew that comfort produced conversation, and conversation produced information that saved Allied lives. After initial interrogation in England, most U-boat prisoners were shipped to Canada, which housed the majority of German naval prisoners of war for the duration. At peak capacity, Canada held roughly 33,800 German military prisoners in 25 to 26 dedicated camps. The largest were at Lethbridge and Medicine Hat in Alberta, each holding around 12,500 men. The camps were run by the Veterans Guard of Canada, mostly men who had served in the First World War, under strict Geneva Convention compliance. Conditions were so good that Canadian civilians living near the camps believed the prisoners received better food than they themselves did under wartime rationing. The prisoners ate meat, vegetables, bread, and sometimes fruit at a time when Canadian housewives were struggling with ration books. It was an irony not lost on anyone. Prisoners worked in agriculture and logging, earning a nominal wage. They organised sports leagues, theatrical performances, and educational courses. Some camps had orchestras. Others had libraries stocked with books in German. Officers' camps allowed considerable freedom within the compound. Men studied languages, took correspondence courses, and prepared for whatever life would await them after the war. The camps were not paradise. There were tensions between committed Nazis and those who had lost faith in the regime. There were escape attempts, including several elaborate tunnel projects that kept the guards on edge. At Camp 30 in Bowmanville, the shackling crisis of 1942, a retaliatory measure ordered by both sides after the Dieppe raid, led to a confrontation between guards and prisoners that required tear gas to resolve. But compared to what Soviet captivity meant, these were problems of a fundamentally different order. When the war ended, approximately 6,000 German prisoners requested permission to remain in Canada permanently. Though all were initially repatriated through Britain in 1946, large numbers later returned and settled as immigrants. They became farmers and tradesmen and businessmen in the communities that had once held them behind wire. Some married Canadian women. Some raised families in the same provinces where they had spent their years as prisoners. The transition from enemy to neighbour was, in many cases, remarkably smooth. Kretschmer himself spent nearly 7 years as a prisoner of war, primarily at Camp 30 in Bowmanville, Ontario. When he was finally released, he returned to Germany, joined the new West German Navy, the Bundesmarine, and rose to the rank of Flotilla Admiral. From May 1965, he served as NATO Chief of Staff for Allied Forces Baltic approaches, working alongside the British and Canadian officers whose predecessors had pulled him from the Atlantic 24 years earlier. His entire post-war career was, in a sense, a testament to the relationship that could exist between enemies who treated each other with professional respect. The American experience was more variable, and the inconsistency itself became part of the U-boat crew's calculation. At its best, American captivity was excellent. The most famous case was the crew of U-505, captured on June 4, 1944, by Captain Daniel Gallery's hunter-killer task group centered on the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal. It was the first capture of an enemy warship at sea by the United States Navy since the War of 1812. Of 60 crew members, 59 survived. They were transported in absolute secrecy, first to Bermuda and then to Camp Ruston in Louisiana, where they were held in isolation so the Kriegsmarine would believe U-505 had been lost with all hands. The secrecy was vital because the Americans had captured the submarine's Enigma code machine and current code books intact. Treatment at Camp Ruston was good by all accounts. But the darker side of American captivity was real, and word of it reached the U-boat fleet through channels that prisoners of war always find. The case of Korvettenkapitan Werner Henke, commander of U-515, was the most disturbing. Henke was a Knight's Cross recipient and an aggressive commander who had been falsely accused by British wartime propaganda of machine-gunning survivors from the merchant ship SS Ceramic. When Gallery's group captured U-515 on April 9, 1944, Henke and about 40 of his crew were picked up. American intelligence officers at the secret interrogation facility at Fort Hunt, Virginia, known under the cover designation P.O. Box 1142, used the threat of extraditing Henke to Britain for a war crimes trial to pressure him into cooperating. Henke eventually realized he had been deceived. On June 15, 1944, he walked deliberately toward the perimeter fence of the compound in broad daylight. He climbed the fence. He ignored the guards' challenges. He was shot and killed. It was, by every credible analysis, a deliberate act. Suicide by guard. He remains the only U-boat commander killed while attempting to escape from American custody. There were other incidents. When 4 U-boats surrendered at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire in May 1945, a subsequent Navy investigation confirmed that American prize crews had looted personal property from the German submariners, taking revolvers, military decorations, food, and parts of their uniforms in violation of the Geneva Convention. The commander of U-873 complained formally. Some prisoners were briefly held in the Boston Charles Street Jail alongside civilian criminals before being transferred to proper prisoner of war facilities. None of this was systematic policy. Where professional officers like Gallery ran the process, American treatment was exemplary. Where it was left to ad hoc arrangements with dockyard sailors and shore personnel who had lost friends and comrades to U-boat attacks, abuses happened. But from the perspective of a German sailor in the water, the distinction between good American captivity and bad American captivity was invisible. The British were more consistent. That consistency mattered. And then there was the Soviet Union. If the preference for British over American captivity was a matter of nuance and reliability, the terror of Soviet captivity was absolute and well-founded. The total number of German military personnel taken prisoner by the Soviet Union during the war was between 2.7 and 3 million. Soviet records from the NKVD acknowledge that 363,000 died in captivity. Western academic research tells a very different story. The West German Maschke Commission, which completed its work in 1974, concluded the real death toll was at least 1,094,000. The historian Rüdiger Overmans, whose work is considered the most authoritative modern analysis, places the maximum at approximately 1 million. The overall mortality rate of German prisoners in Soviet hands was somewhere between 15% by Soviet accounting and 35.8% by Western academic consensus. For those captured early in the war, the numbers were catastrophic. Of the 91,000 German soldiers taken prisoner at Stalingrad in February 1943, only approximately 6,000 were ever repatriated, a survival rate of less than 7%. Prisoners were used as forced labor in mines, factories, and construction projects across the Soviet Union, from the coal pits of the Donets Basin to the railway construction camps of Siberia and Central Asia. Rations were minimal, often below subsistence level. Medical care was often non-existent. Disease, particularly typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis, swept through the camps. Men weakened by hunger were worked until they collapsed. Those who could no longer work were sometimes simply left to die. The last German prisoners of war did not return from Soviet captivity until 1956, 11 full years after the war ended. When they finally came home, many were physically broken, weighing far less than they had when they were captured, carrying diseases and psychological wounds that would never fully heal. For U-boat crews specifically, direct capture by the Soviets was rare because the U-boat war was fought primarily in the Atlantic, far from Soviet naval reach. But the cases that did occur were grim. In July 1944, U-250 was sunk in the Gulf of Finland by Soviet submarine chaser M-O-103. Of the 52 men aboard, only 6 escaped the sinking. Those 6 were captured by the Soviets, the rest went down with the boat. The intelligence value of the capture was significant. The Soviets recovered intact German T-5 acoustic homing torpedoes from the wreck, which became a subject of direct correspondence between Stalin and Churchill. But the fate of the surviving crew members in Soviet hands was far less documented and far less comfortable than what their counterparts experienced in British or Canadian camps. The word spread through the U-boat fleet, through letters that made it past censors, through the few men who were exchanged or repatriated during the war, through the simple logic of geography and news. Everyone knew, if you ended up in Russian hands, you might never come home. If you ended up in British hands, you would be fed, housed, treated under the Geneva Convention and eventually sent home. That knowledge shaped behavior. It was not unique to the German Navy. Throughout history, soldiers and sailors have made calculations about who to surrender to when defeat becomes inevitable. In the First World War, German soldiers on the Western Front overwhelmingly preferred to surrender to British or French forces rather than to the Russians on the Eastern Front for remarkably similar reasons. The pattern is as old as warfare itself. Men facing death will seek out the enemy most likely to let them live. Dönitz understood this better than anyone. When Adolf Hitler killed himself on April 30, 1945, Dönitz became head of state of what remained of the Third Reich. His overriding political and military objective in those final days was not to continue the war. It was to extricate as many German servicemen as possible into Western Allied captivity, rather than Soviet hands. Every diplomatic maneuver, every partial surrender, every delay was calculated with this single goal in mind. He negotiated partial surrenders with the British in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands before the general capitulation, buying time for German forces in the east to retreat westward. Ships of every kind, from destroyers to fishing boats, were pressed into service to evacuate soldiers and civilians from the Baltic coast, racing to reach British or American-controlled territory before the Soviets closed in. It was the largest naval evacuation in history, dwarfing even Dunkirk. Millions of German soldiers and civilians were moved west by sea in those final weeks. On May 4, he ordered all U-boats to cease offensive operations. The following day, the Regenbogen Order was transmitted, directing the scuttling of the entire U-boat fleet. The word Regenbogen meant rainbow, a grimly poetic name for the destruction of the fleet. 8 minutes later, Dönitz countermanded his own order. He realized that mass scuttling would destroy the goodwill needed to negotiate favorable surrender terms with Field Marshal Montgomery and the Western Allies. The boats had to be surrendered intact if the men were to be treated as legitimate prisoners of war. Despite the countermand, over 200 U-boats were scuttled by their crews in ports across Germany, Norway, and occupied Europe. Many commanders chose to destroy their boats rather than hand them over to any enemy. But those who were at sea, those who had a choice of where to go, overwhelmingly chose to go west. What followed was one of the most remarkable episodes in naval history. Of the 49 U-boats still at sea when the general surrender took effect on May 8, 1945, the overwhelming majority headed west. They sailed toward British ports, toward American ports, toward Canadian ports, toward anywhere that was not the Soviet Union. The first U-boat to surrender was U-1009, a Type 7C commanded by Oberleutnant Klaus Hilgendorf. She entered Loch Eriboll on the remote northern coast of Scotland at 08:15 on May 10, 1945, flying a black rag from her periscope in place of a surrender flag. The crew did not know what to expect. They had been told by propaganda that the Allies would shoot them on sight or send them to labour camps. Instead, they were met by Royal Navy personnel who boarded the submarine, searched the crew, confiscated weapons, and escorted the boat to an anchorage. The process was efficient, firm, and correct. No one was harmed. Over the following 12 days, 33 U-boats were processed through Loch Eriboll alone. The remote Scottish loch, surrounded by bare hills and sheep pasture, became one of the strangest naval bases in history. U-boats that had terrorized the North Atlantic for years now lay quietly at anchor under the grey Highland skies, their crews lining up on deck for inspection by Royal Navy boarding parties. Dozens more surrendered at ports across Britain in the days that followed, arriving at Loch Alsh, where their torpedoes were stripped, and then being sailed onward to the collection points at Lissahalli and Loch Ryan. Over 1,600 German crew members were searched and processed for transfer to prisoner of war camps. On May 14, 1945, Admiral Sir Max Horton accepted the formal symbolic surrender of 8 U-boats at Lissahalli. Royal Navy, Royal Canadian Navy, and United States Navy escorts were all present, a deliberate gesture of inter-allied cooperation. 9 more U-boats surrendered in the Western Atlantic to American or Canadian forces. Not a single U-boat surrendered at sea to the Soviet Navy. The 10 boats that eventually went to the Soviet Union were transferred months later by Britain, after being processed through Lissahalli. 2 U-boats, U-530 and U-977, made the extraordinary decision to flee all the way to Argentina rather than surrender to any Allied force. Captain Lieutenant Otto Kretschmer of U-530 told his interrogators that he believed his crew would receive better treatment in Argentina than in Allied hands. U-977, under Oberleutnant Heinz Schaffer, made an astonishing 66-day submerged transit using her snorkel to reach the Argentine coast. Both boats and their crews were eventually handed over to the United States. The documented attitudes of surrendering crews tell the story in human terms. At Loch Eriboll, Fregattenkapitän Otto Heinrich Juncker, commander of the long-range cargo submarine U-532, returning from a mission to Japan, demanded to be taken to senior British military authorities. He proposed, apparently in complete seriousness, that Britain should join forces with the surviving German Navy to fight the Soviet Union. Admiral Horton's dry response was that Juncker should be dispatched to Liverpool so Horton could see this phenomenon for himself. The episode is documented in the reports of the 5th Escort Group and in naval historian Derek Waller's detailed study of the surrender process. When U-234 surrendered that same day, her captain, Captain Lieutenant Johann Heinrich Fehler, told his American captors with remarkable candor that he expected better food in an Allied prisoner of war camp than he had eaten in months aboard his own boat. He was not wrong. For men who had subsisted on increasingly meager U-boat rations while breathing recycled air in a steel coffin, the promise of regular meals, open sky, and physical safety was not abstract. It was the most concrete thing in the world. The Royal Navy's tradition of treating defeated sailors with professional respect had deep roots. It was not a policy invented for the Second World War. British naval officers had, since at least the Napoleonic era, regarded enemy naval personnel as professional adversaries rather than criminals. When a French or Spanish warship struck her colours after a battle in the Age of Sail, the defeated officers were typically invited to dine with the captain who had bested them. Their swords were sometimes returned as a gesture of respect. This tradition carried forward through the centuries. It shaped the culture of the Royal Navy in ways that went beyond formal orders or regulations. It was something instilled in officers from their earliest training, a sense that the sea itself was the common enemy and that all who sailed upon it, regardless of which flag they flew, shared a bond that war could test but not entirely break. The distinction may seem subtle, but it was everything. It meant that when a U-boat surfaced and its crew came up with their hands raised, the default British response was rescue, not retribution. HMS Hesperus rescued survivors of U-223 in 1943. When U-1206 sank off the Scottish coast near Peterhead in April 1945 after a catastrophic malfunction of her high-pressure toilet system, the crew was picked up by a combination of Royal Navy minesweeper trawlers and a local lobster boat. The survivors were taken ashore and, according to local accounts, offered tea on china by a Scottish family at Cruden Bay. These were not grand strategic gestures. They were small acts of decency. But word of them travelled, and in a service where men measured their life expectancy in patrols rather than years, decency mattered. There is an important caveat that honesty demands. The claim that German submariners begged to surrender specifically to British ships is not a direct quotation from any documented German naval officer. No single primary source contains those exact words. What exists is a clear and verifiable pattern of behaviour. When given a choice, U-boat crews sailed west. They sought British ports. They accepted British and American captivity. They avoided Soviet forces at all costs. The behaviour is real. The dramatic phrasing is a simplification. The British were not saints in this war. The Battle of the Atlantic was fought with savage intensity on both sides. Royal Navy escorts depth-charged submarines knowing full well that the men inside would die horribly if the hull cracked. Not every sinking resulted in a rescue attempt. Some U-boats were destroyed in circumstances where rescue was impossible. The war at sea was merciless and both sides knew it. But there was a line, and the British generally stayed on the correct side of it. There is no documented Second World War Royal Navy incident comparable to the notorious Baralong affair of the First World War, in which a British vessel's crew killed the survivors of a sinking U-boat. After the surrenders were complete, the Allied powers had to decide what to do with over 150 intact U-boats. The answer was Operation Deadlight. Between November 17th, 1945 and February 11th, 1946, the Royal Navy towed 116 surrendered U-boats to deep water off the coast of Northern Ireland near Malin Head and scuttled them. It was a massive and difficult operation. Many of the boats had been poorly maintained in their final months of service and were in bad condition. Some broke loose from their tow lines in heavy Atlantic weather and had to be sunk by gunfire or depth charges where they drifted. Others were used as target practice by the Royal Air Force, which bombed them in the open sea. One by one, they went to the bottom, joining the hundreds of their sisters that already lay scattered across the floor of the Atlantic. Approximately 30 boats were spared from destruction and divided among the Allied powers, including Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and Norway, for technical evaluation. Engineers and naval architects crawled through every compartment, studied every system, and produced detailed reports that would influence submarine design for decades. The advanced Type 21 electric boat, in particular, was revolutionary. Its streamlined hull and high-capacity batteries allowed fully submerged speeds that no previous submarine had achieved. The lessons learned from these captured boats directly influenced the design of the next generation of American, British, and Soviet submarines. Of the entire wartime fleet, only a handful of U-boats survive today as museum vessels. U-505 sits in a specially constructed underground exhibit hall at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, where visitors can walk through the same cramped compartments where 60 men once lived and fought. U-995 stands in a memorial at Le Beau near Kiel in Germany, overlooking the Baltic Sea from which so many boats departed and so few returned. The rest are gone, their stories preserved only in documents, memoirs, and the memories of the last generation that sailed them. Herbert Werner, one of the very few U-boat captains who survived the entire war at sea, wrote his memoir Iron Coffins in 1969. It opens with a stark declaration that 28,000 out of 39,000 men in the German U-boat force had disappeared beneath the waves. Werner himself served on multiple boats from the early years of the war through to its final weeks, witnessing the transformation of the service from an elite strike force into what amounted to a suicide mission. He watched friends and fellow officers leave port and never return, one patrol after another. By the final months, there were more empty chairs in the officers' mess than occupied ones. He was captured by the British at a Norwegian U-boat base in May 1945. He was sent briefly to a French prisoner of war camp, escaped multiple times, and eventually immigrated to the United States in 1957. His book remains one of the most widely read first-hand accounts of submarine warfare ever written, and it captures the atmosphere of a service that knew by the final years that death was more likely than survival. Werner wrote not to glorify the U-boat war, but to bear witness. He wanted the world to know what those men had endured and what the cost had been. His account is unflinching about the terror, the losses, and the growing hopelessness that consumed the U-boat arm as the Allies gained the upper hand. Other veterans told their stories in different ways. Heinz Schaffer, the commander who took U-977 to Argentina, published his memoir in Germany in 1950, making it one of the earliest post-war U-boat accounts. He explained his decision to flee in terms that were blunt and human. He believed the Allies intended to punish Germany, that Joseph Goebbels' propaganda about the Morgenthau Plan was true, and that his crew's only chance of decent treatment lay in reaching a neutral country. He was wrong about the Morgenthau Plan, which was never implemented, but his fear was real, and it was shared by thousands of his comrades across the dying U-boat fleet. The story of the German U-boat fleet and its final surrender is not simply a story about military logistics or prisoner of war conventions. It is a story about what happens when men who have been trained to fight to the death are given a reason to live. The reason was not ideology. It was not patriotism. It was the knowledge passed from boat to boat and crew to crew across the years of a long and terrible war that one enemy would treat them as human beings and another might not. The British did not earn that trust through grand declarations or propaganda broadcasts. They earned it through individual acts. A sailor climbing down a scrambling net to pull Otto Kretschmer from the freezing Atlantic. A cup of tea offered to the soaking crew of U-1206 on the Scottish coast. A comfortable chair and a warm meal at Trent Park, where the hidden microphones recorded not just intelligence but the relief of men who realized they were going to survive. 785 U-boats were lost during the war. 28,000 men went to the bottom of the Atlantic, the Arctic, the Mediterranean, and the Baltic. They died in explosions, in flooding compartments, in fires, in the crushing pressure of deep water. They died young, most of them. Many were barely out of their teens. The U-boat service was built on their sacrifice, and it ended with the survivors making the most human choice imaginable. Given the option of who would hold their fate, they chose the enemy they trusted. They sailed west toward the cold Scottish lochs, the Irish harbours, the Canadian camps where men who had tried to destroy the Allied merchant fleet would learn to farm, to play cricket, and eventually to call their former enemies neighbours. That is the full story. Not a myth of begging, but a documented history of rational men choosing survival, choosing dignity, and choosing the captor most likely to grant them both.